when we're talking about items, and let's get into a little bit more detail about what items are. Um, let's say we start with this is an Inventor assembly, right? So it's got a few pieces to it. And let's say, this is what I've drawn in Inventor. And that's great. I've got some shapes on a screen, right? But this ultimately has a part number in the rest of our organization. If this is something that we make, we are creating this, we probably have given it a number, a part number, right? And we've got an Inventor assembly document for it, but that's not the only way that the information about this part number is captured, or that's not the only artifact in our environment, at least from a file perspective, that describes this thing that we make, right? We may have a step file of it to be used in another assembly or to provide to a customer or a vendor for quoting purposes, right? We may have DXF files of individual pieces for machining purposes, or, if you've got sheet metal. If we're machining this on like a CNC, there's going to be a file that captures, the machine code, ideally. And especially things like NC files, if you're keeping revisions of the model, ideally you would want to keep revisions of the code necessary to have it cut on a machine, right? We've got typically a drawing of this. There might be a PDF of that drawing. There might be work instructions for how, to put it into a machine. There might be assembly instructions. There might be a quality inspection plan. So we have all of these documents, in our environment floating around that really describe this part number. But they're never really that well organized, right? They're never all neatly lined up in one place. We've got the models in Vault, the drawings in Vault, a step file over here on a share, the NC files on a computer in the shop. These documents are scattered in SharePoint or a Teams folder or somebody's computer, right? And so this is where the Vault Item Master can really be a huge benefit for not only engineering, but really the rest of the organization. Because you can take an item, it becomes a bucket, essentially a container, with that part number, and all of these different files that might be floating around the organization, they can all go in one spot, well organized, other than, despite what you see here on the screen. And I can go to one place to find all of the information about this item, this part number, right? So in addition to those file relationships, we can also relate items to each other, right? An item can be a parent and it can have a child, and those children can have children, right? So this is how you can develop a bill of materials structure, right? It's different than, say, a file attachment. File attachments, if you're attaching one file to another, technically there is directionality there. One is the parent and one is the child, but it's not quite as obvious because that information is only available like on the uses and where used tabs of the file. An item in Vault Professional has a bill of materials, and it has children, and it is used in other places, right? But even these file relationships, how we've got everything, all of these various files linked to a part number, not all of these files are equally important, right? The CAD file really is the primary digital representation of this. It has, I would say, generally the most accurate information, right? And so items, when they are linked to files, they have actually different possible types of links, right? We have a primary link that would say typically would link to the CAD model and a specific link type for drawings. But then when it comes to things like standard components or virtual components or model states, which we'll get into in a little bit, you can very carefully control how a file is associated to an item. And you can even have attachments. So like things like Word documents would typically be attachments. And one very interesting thing about that is you can actually link a file to an item and pin that version. So even if the file that it is attached to changes, it versions up, the attachment can always point to, for the item, can always point to a specific version of that file. In addition to all the other, you know, behaviors, right, that items can have. So life cycles and properties, you know, Vault items can behave essentially just like files, just about, in terms of life cycle behaviors. There's some minor differences, but mostly when you get into things like creating PDFs and step files automatically with the job processor. But in terms of, you know, can the record have a status or a state? Can it go through transitions? Can you control access to the record based on the state? Items behave just like files. And file items can lock the files that they are linked to depending on the link type. So the primary linked file, say the CAD file that is related to the item, it can become locked for edit so people can't check it out when the item becomes locked. So it's a way for you to control access to the files. And in fact, you know, items have been around in Vault Professional for many years, at least 15 as far as I know, maybe even longer. And before file life cycles even existed in Vault, items were there and they had life cycles, and that's how you might control access to files way, way back in, say, Product Stream, if any of you have been using Vault for a really long time. So again, items have life cycles. They also have their own set of properties. So they are distinct from any properties that are of linked files, right? So the item can have its own set of properties, but they can be mapped to the file properties. So what this lets you do is you can take properties that are owned by CAD, by the people that create the CAD files. Those properties can be carried forward to the item record. But you can have other properties that are owned by something outside of CAD that maybe have no bearing on the information in CAD, but can still be captured and maintained on the item record. So the item is sort of like a superset of all of the information about the CAD file. It's all the CAD file stuff, plus maybe some additional information that you don't want to have on the CAD file. Right? And then one other interesting bit of functionality, change order functionality in Vault. It's another thing that a lot of Vault users do not use, but items have some very specific behaviors in the context of change orders. One of them is when you are adding records to a change order, the controlled records on a change order for items, they can have change specific properties. So a really good example would be disposition. What's going to happen to this part number, you know, as a result of this change? Are we reworking existing stock? Are we scrapping it? Right? You can have those change order specific properties for items, but you cannot have them for files. And item states can be manipulated automatically when a change order is closed. With files, again, that doesn't happen as far as I know. So when I close my change order in Vault, the item state can automatically change, say, from review to released. So I don't have to remember to go back and set that final state. Items have categories, right? They have bills of material, right? It is actually called a bill of materials. We'll see some examples here in a little bit. And what's interesting about this bill of materials behavior is that the BOM can be extracted from the CAD file, from Inventor, from AutoCAD Electrical, from AutoCAD Mechanical, and even from, you know, some third-party tools like SolidWorks. We can extract the bill of materials from the CAD file into Vault Professional. And this is one of the most important reasons why you would want to use items when you're using Vault, is to separate that BOM data from the CAD file, to release it from being trapped inside that CAD file, and then manipulate it in some way, right? You could turn rows off if there was a file in the model that you didn't really, or a part number in the model that shouldn't be on the BOM, you can turn that row off. You can add rows to the BOM, right? Vault Professional lets you compare bills of material between revisions, which is something that you can't do in something like Inventor. You can export that data from Vault. For AutoCAD Electrical, that has some very interesting behavior where you can actually include tags and installation and location data in the bill of materials, which can be very, very important for assembly purposes. But what's very important, most important of all, is if the CAD file can still own the CAD portion of the BOM. So when you update the BOM in CAD and update your item in Vault, the CAD portion of the BOM updates, right? So you're not removing ownership of the BOM from the CAD file. That stays associated, right? And finally, another very interesting behavior of items in Vault is the ability to capture model states in a way that you can see those model states outside of CAD, right? If you're just looking at the file in the Vault, it's not clear if there are model states and what those model states might be, and maybe their extended properties. With Vault items, when you extract the item information or the part number information from an Inventor part or assembly, each model state can become an item record that is separate from the CAD file, but again, still linked to it. That's an overview of what items are and what capabilities they have. There is a lot of capability there. Anyone who owns Vault Professional has access to that capability. And the vast majority of those of you watching right now, or at least while we're live at least, aren't using it at all, right? So if you have been looking for ways to switch to a more part number centric workflow in engineering to facilitate how you communicate data with the rest of the company, this is what you could get by using items.